Thank you, everyone. So now we'll be talking startups view the region and the sort of opportunities and challenges that are presented to young, promising companies. And to discuss that with me, I would like to invite up Amy Oldenburg, who's the Managing Director and Head of Emerging Markets Equity at Morgan Stanley. Omair Ansari, who's the Chief Executive and Co-founder of Abhi. And Cassie McGoldrick, who is a Regional Director of Financial Services for the Gulf at the British Embassy in Dubai. Thank you all for joining us. I think I would like to start by asking you, maybe I would like to start with Abhi, who is a representative of the startup world, very, very directly. And when you think about setting up shop in this part of the world, well, first of all, what is it that draws you here? And what is it about this region that makes you excited to build a business? And then second of all, what keeps you up at night?
Many things keep me up at night, but I'll leave that for last. In terms of the region, for us, so a bit of background, I finished high school in Abu Dhabi, and so was in the region before I think a lot of people even knew the region internationally. There's always been a mass potential for the bloc, and what's happened over the past few years, I'd say, is within each country, the regulators have caught up with that understanding of what's happened in other emerging markets in terms of similar, like China, for example, where leapfrogging really took place, specifically when it came to banking infrastructure and lending. And I'll talk about that given that we're in Fintech. And they really have opened up the doors to say, hey, come here, use this as a market for you to launch in. There's a large gap when it comes to digital infrastructure, lending infrastructure that exists in the country. So as a market in itself, it's very lucrative, very large. It allows you to test things much more easily, I'd say, comparatively to some other markets you typically launch in. So your go-to-market can be a little bit quicker. And then obviously from there, use it as your launching pad to be able to go elsewhere, because the whole idea of having homegrown companies and then being backed by the immense amount of sovereign wealth funds, for example, that give you the capability of saying, okay, here's growth equity, now let's go abroad, as opposed to the other way around. I think that's one dynamic that's changed dramatically over the last, I'd say, decade or so, where historically it was international companies which originated abroad and then came over here. Now the other way is happening. Homegrown companies are using this as a launch pad to be able to go abroad. So I think that's something that really attracted us to the region. In terms of what keeps me up at night, regulation. At the end of the day, we are a heavily regulated, in a very heavily regulated industry, and things are constantly changing. So it's, though it keeps us up at night, it also means you have to constantly be in front of the regulator explaining what's happening with the business, because we are moving fast, we are trying new things. And as long as you have that two-way communication, you can have slightly better sleepless nights, but nonetheless, they will be sleepless.
Just to follow up on that, so how receptive and responsive are governments in the region to the sort of, questions, desires, problems that you come to them with?
So the door is open, I'll say that. We, for example, arrived in the UAE, we arrived in Saudi. The regulators' doors are open for you to go and have that conversation. Now they're tying up with some accelerator programs as well for you to go and go through that track to try and get that fast track licensing as well. It's expensive. I'd say that's the only aspect which is on the prohibitive side. But they're open to the conversation, and then from there on in is about how often you're able to be in front of them for them to be able to get comfortable with what you're trying to do. It does help, though, I'd say, and what we've done in all the markets we've gone live in the GCC, is going in with a trusted local partner. Someone who's been in the region for a while, understands the nuances. There's a friendly face that's there that allows you to be able to kind of fast-track that process.
That's interesting, and that's also true in many other emerging markets. Amy, you have a broad overview of emerging markets. How do the sort of grumbles or the sort of again, opportunities that you see here differ from other parts of the world that you cover? And other parts of the world which were at a certain point at a similar stage of development when it comes to financial services and innovation.
Sure, and full disclosure, I'm also an independent director on the Abhi board, so I've seen things here firsthand in the region. When it comes to
Sorry, I think we have a problem with the mic. That one?
Is this mic on? Yep, great. So full disclosure, I'm also an independent director on the Abhi board, so I've seen things firsthand with Omair and Abhi in the region and across Southeast Asia. But I think broadly across the emerging market space, I think I'll focus on the opportunities specifically in this region. When it comes to the regulators being open, very supportive, even as Omair had mentioned, with the door being open. Some of the talent opportunities here that we can continue to focus on, it's one of the most attractive places that I think we're seeing right now, specifically in the fintech space. There's other areas, and I think especially right now where you have challenges in China, you have folks shying away from North Asia, even Korea. I was in Korea and Taiwan last week. Korea has some pretty difficult hiring and firing rules that make it very difficult for any sort of technology companies or any company in general to manage the talent there. And it's one of the things when we're just looking at areas of opportunity, of growth, where you have banking penetration levels still low, this area is quite attractive. And I think one of the things that we're up against is companies, even if it's in other areas, if they built fintech businesses in Latin America or other parts of Eastern Europe, their target is now the Middle East.
So how transferable is the experience from these other markets to the Middle East? Are there any sort of specific things about this region which make it different and which require some sort of a specific adaptation, if you will? I mean, every region is idiosyncratic, and every country is within each region is idiosyncratic. But are there sort of certain broad themes that make this place stand out? Again, both in terms of opportunity, but also in terms of just adaptations.
Sure. I mean, I'll start, and I'm happy to pass it over to the panel too to expand on this. But I'm a big believer in culture and also like really understanding the localized culture. And I think that's one of the things for companies coming from other parts of the world and entering this region, really understanding the nuances, the local nuances, and it's of every single market. I think what tends to happen across emerging markets broadly, and especially by developed market investors, they just want to club everything together. It's Latin America, it's Europe, it's Middle East, Asia. BRICS. Maybe you get North Asia and South Asia, but there's so much more nuance to many of these markets. So really taking the time to understand the different dynamics, understand the consumer, understand the level of trust, the history with the industry that you're entering, and what consumers might have dealt with in the past that you need to be aware of. All of that is so important.
Cassie, so following up on that, how you oversee the region when it comes to financial services. How fragmented is it, and how harmonized is it? Obviously, the whole region is very large and has 1.5 large countries in it, but a lot of the rest is quite small. So Bahrain, as I was saying earlier, a beautiful place, but not the world's largest market. So if you want to succeed for ambitious startups, for ambitious fintech companies, you want to cover the entire region. But each country has its own regulations. Each country has its own cultural, I suspect, cultural idiosyncrasies. So how when you look at the market, at the sort of regional market, how unified or fragmented do you see it?
Yeah, I think each of the countries are very, very different. I've had lots of kind of conversations with people today about just how different the regulation is, how different the culture is. And I think, if you're just sitting in the West, you can't necessarily appreciate that. I think being here in the market, just in terms of how they're planning to develop the sector as well, every country has their own vision plan, and it is quite separate. I think if you take the UAE as an example, looking at it from a fintech perspective, you've obviously got quite a small national population, a very heavy expatriate population, so you've got a lot more interest in things like remittance and payments and that side of fintech. But you've got a very well-developed regulatory regime with things like Hub 71 and lots of regulation and certainty. So it's very well-developed and you're going into a very different ecosystem. Whereas, obviously, if you're going to Saudi Arabia, you've got a much larger population, which is Saudi-based, predominantly people under 30s, very high kind of tech adoption. It's a very different market, and in terms of opportunities, like, a lot of retail-focused activities that's happening there. Bahrain, again, is very, very different. They were, I guess, one of the first countries to actually kind of move on fintech within the region. And you've got things like Bahrain Fintech Bay, which provides different support. So I think it is quite fragmented. There are obviously some regulations that are being developed by, like, data localization, that I think makes it hard for fintech companies to operate across border in the region, but also globally. And I think from a UK perspective, we're always quite global and internationalist. And when we're thinking about regulatory development and regulatory alignment in the future, we're coming at it from that angle. So I would say there is definitely differences in terms of the market and the regulation. But I think, as other panelists have said, sometimes it's hard operating within the EU, even though that's part of a single market, so you're always going to have challenges.
Are the governments in the region talking to each other about making the regulations, making cross-border functioning of a startup of financial services smoother, or are they sort of somewhat reluctant and prefer their own individual sandboxes?
Yeah, I can't really talk to the conversations that they're having behind closed doors. I think lots of the challenges facing the fintech sector at the moment, things like AI, are obviously being spoken about kind of in international forums and in international boards, and the GCC kind of do participate within those discussions. So I think at that level there is a lot of discussions happening. Obviously there are organisations within the GCC that are having discussions as well, but then governments are obviously independent. So I think conversations are happening, but I'm not kind of best placed to comment to what extent.
Omair, I'd like to come back to you and ask you about talent management in the region. So, in some ways, it's an incredibly attractive place to come and live. A lot of the place, a lot of the city-states certainly are, very comfortable. Is it hard or easy to get both foreign talent to come in and support your business, but also to attract and recruit local talent?
So very easy now from a international talent perspective. It wasn't the case even just prior to COVID. It was not a place which a lot of people had either been to or, and now I think given what's happening in developed markets, specifically Europe, from a taxation perspective, a lot of very good talent is coming through. I'll say, for example, we posted a job for a product manager, and we had people who were very senior, like the likes of Amazon and Revolut, apply to us, which we're a Series A startup, and never thought we'd be able to see that kind of talent. So I think that aspect's become a lot easier now for the region, which is great. However, what that does do for the local talent pool is it's kind of almost crowding them out. And that's the aspect. I was speaking with a couple of people earlier on this. There's now this real shift that's happening in terms of that talent pool that has been here for a while, but not necessarily have the skill set that international person would. And because they're now willing to move here, there's a whole kind of paradigm shift happening in terms of employment capability of some of the local talent. So I think that's something which is structurally interesting, and it'll be interesting how that plays out, because unemployment could become an issue on that front.
Can I just ask you very quickly, just follow up, and then I'll hand over to Amy. Has attracting foreign talent become more difficult over the past year as a result of the tensions in the region?
No, not at all. In fact, I mean, I'd say it's even spurred it even more so, especially from, and look, we always look at developed markets as the ones where we're looking for talent. And in actuality, and this goes into the localization and nuances of these markets. Look, we started the business in Pakistan, and then we launched in UAE afterwards. And we're now the largest EWA player in the UAE. And it was bringing talent who, coming from places like Pakistan, Egypt, et cetera, which are going through macro turmoil, who've built very interesting, or worked at least on building very interesting businesses in those markets, who have the hunger, the thirst, as well as the understanding of localization for these markets to come through. So, no, we've seen no slowdown when it comes to geopolitics.
Amy, did you want to chip in?
I was just going to add on the talent piece. I have a team that sits in Riyadh. And one of the things as a manager, to Omair's point, that I have to spend a lot of time thinking about is how do I upskill the talent that's already on the ground? Because there's certain things, as we continue to see this growth happen in the region, there's expansion of businesses that they've never had on the ground. So much of the talent here may not even have experience with what we're building. And that's where it's a bit of a hybrid approach to bring in some of that other talent from the other parts of the world. And on the flip side, you have to really help educate them on the nuances of the market. So I would say from a management perspective, there's a very heavy focus on talent management and culture management going forward.
Where is most of the talent coming from, the foreign talent here? So I remember hearing from certain people, we talked to, that a lot of very experienced, certainly on the consulting side, a lot of very experienced professionals are moving from China to this region, for instance. Foreigners who used to be based in China because of the increasing difficulty of doing business there, they're not going back home, they're transferring here. Is that something you're seeing? Amy?
So very much is picked up, for sure, with the current environment. So I think Hong Kong's a target. Financial services being a bit weaker in London these days, especially with Brexit. There's an opportunity that's a nice place to pull talent back into the region. So I think there's, especially folks that have experience in other emerging markets, they're very comfortable going into a new market, and they want that growth opportunity. They want that emerging industry aspect of it, and they're quite good at executing in those markets. So I would say those are two target markets that I've seen more recently.
Cassie, do you see a lot of city folk flocking to this region now that London has become a little bit less attractive as a result of Brexit?
I mean, for fintech, London still remains very strong, kind of consistently in the top three globally. We've got over 3,000 fintechs in the UK. We have a third of our unicorns are fintechs. We actually have the highest concentration of fintech unicorns in London than any other international financial centre globally. And after the US, we're the second largest destination for fintech investment. So I think it still remains very, very strong and is still a really, really good location for people to start fintech companies. But there is a lot of interest in the Gulf. I think a lot of UK fintechs, when they're thinking about the region, it's about partnering and it's about an addition to the services that they have in the UK rather than, people kind of completely moving all of their fintech functions here. So yeah, there's definitely growing interest within the region. But I wouldn't say it's kind of an either or from how I'm seeing it on my side.
I want to come back to the question of local talent a little bit. And I know that a lot of the countries in the region are putting a lot of resources in order to nurture local talent. Certainly technologically, there are sort of a number of AI universities popping up and actually attracting a lot of foreign professors, very, very accomplished academics, to teach there and in fact do research. But those things take a while to get going, and certainly, you need at least a few years to even get the first class of new talented engineers, software engineers, or other specialists graduating. How long do you think it will take, or when do you see these investments in human capital that the local governments are making beginning to pay off in a way that is noticeable for you as an employer?
So I'd say it's already happening, because what we end up doing, and I'll give you a case in point, and it's not just here. When we started in Pakistan, for example, there was no local talent for what we were building because it had never been done before. So what that means is the mentorship angle that's required as the kind of founders of the business, to tag them with someone abroad for them to scale up as quick as they can is very important. So I'd say the learning curve is very steep. I mean, it's similar to background in investment banking. If you go into any analyst pool, for example, the learning curve is very steep. You're thrown into the deep end and you need to learn. You either sink or swim. And I think that's what's happening as well with the local talent pool over here. It's not necessarily that they're saying, we're going to put you through a training program, and then after that training program, you go and apply for a job. Our work with some of the local governments is that we'll take in that pool of talent, and then we will match them with someone who's built fintech, for example, in the product role, someone who's sitting in Brazil. Someone who's sitting in India. They don't necessarily have to be here, but they mentor them, they work with them, and skill them up very quickly for us to be able to hit the ground running.
So for the last couple of minutes, I would like to talk about the market and the sort of we mentioned penetration earlier, which is still lower for many of these services than in other parts of the world. How ready are people, consumers, users of financial services in this region to actually tap these services? Amy, do you have a sense again? Sort of how does that compare with other parts of the world when they were at a similar penetration level? Are people here keener on fintech than in those other places at the time? Less keen?
The one benefit, and I know this has been discussed today already, is just the age of the population. You have a very digitally native, younger set of the population here that makes up a very large percentage. That's super helpful. No matter where you go in the region, in the city or in rural areas, you'll see someone on a smartphone that's scrolling through and using various apps. So that's very positive. I do think there's an element of it as you get into some of these new financial tools. There's an education piece of it for small business owners, for consumers, in terms of what it allows them to do and how it can be helpful to them. So education is always a big key to that also.
Cassie, do you want to chip in on that?
On consumers?
Do you want to, do you have a sort of any thoughts on this sort of same question of the market opportunity and how the sort of market opportunity, maybe even like within the region, do you see some places as being readier to embrace financial innovation on the consumer side than others?
Yeah, I think each market is quite different. I think the UAE's regulatory regime is probably slightly more developed. And then Saudi Arabia, there's obviously a lot happening within that space. But within the smaller markets in the region, like Bahrain as well, they're also thinking about it. And that's kind of partly why my job is here, really. So I'm based in the British Embassy in Dubai, but I'm on secondment from HM Treasury, and it's very much about having those kind of policy conversations. So as their regime develops, so things like open banking, where the UK played a leading role in setting open banking standards, and just a couple of months ago, the new government announced that we're going to be looking at open banking regulation and open finance more broadly. How can we actually work together on areas where regulation is being developed? Because I think, again, in this region, they're obviously not as developed as markets in the West, but they're very, very quickly catching up. And things that we're thinking about, they're also thinking about. So we can learn from them as well as them learning from us. But I would say, again, there's a lot of kind of commonality between the region, but also a lot of differences. And I think that's driven by the different kind of makeup of the population, the sizes, and the consumers, and how they're ready.
Omair, are you sort of surprised by the speed with which people in the region are embracing certain types of product, and maybe surprised by the slowness with which they're embracing some other products? I mean, do you see any differentiation between the sort of things that people here seem to want?
So I'd say I wasn't surprised, but to your point in terms of is the market ready and are products being taken up as quickly as people thought, I think it is. And I put a kind of comparison. If you take, for example, a millionaire who's a car enthusiast who's never seen a Ferrari showroom in his life, and you put him in a Ferrari showroom, I'm pretty sure he's going to buy the Ferrari. And so I think the biggest issue in the region historically has been you've got a good disposable income population. Demographics make sense. They just haven't had access to product. And now product is available. So I'll give you an example. With us in the UAE, when we launched, we had only set aside a portion of capital for us to test our earned wage access product with, which we thought would last us about 2 months. Within the first 2 weeks, we already went through that. So point being that the region is ready, they're literate when it comes to technology. There's just been a lack of access of product and availability of product. So if you can bring something that is localized, that they understand, it's taken up.
Well, that's a wonderful note, positive note, promising note to end on. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up here. Thank you very much to the panelists for an interesting conversation. And I would like to invite Josh back, maybe before we will have a group photo.